The gymnasium at Ridgemont Elementary had the kind of hush that settles over a room built for noise. Confetti drifted from a burst piñata nobody was watching anymore. Near the trophy case, a girl in a yellow dress stood mid-laugh, caught between one moment and the next, because the boy in front of her had just stopped smiling. He wore a navy blazer too sharp for a school carnival, buttoned to the top, hands folded behind his back, like he'd been taught to stand that way before he'd been taught to talk. His eyes weren't on her. They were on the woman behind her, the one adjusting a paper crown on a toddler's head, laughing at something only mothers find funny. He took one step forward, then another. The girl's laugh died in her throat. "Can I borrow your mom?" he said. "Just for today." The girl's mouth fell open. She looked at her mother, then back at him, then at the two men in dark suits, now moving fast through the crowd toward the boy. Men who did not belong at a school carnival, who scanned exits instead of enjoying the day. Nobody in that gymnasium knew his name. Not really. The school record said Daniel Cho, 7 years old, transferred in September, emergency contact listed as a driver instead of a parent. What the records didn't say was that his real name carried weight in 3 countries, that the man who signed his tuition checks answered to nobody, and that the last woman who'd tried to mother him had vanished before his 5th birthday. Taken, not left, though he'd been told otherwise for years. He didn't know all of it either. He only knew that the woman in front of him smelled like cinnamon instead of gunmetal and hand sanitizer, and that when she'd hugged her daughter 20 minutes ago, she hadn't checked over her shoulder first. He wanted that. Just for one afternoon, he wanted to know what it felt like to be someone's, instead of something to be guarded. Across the gym, a car door was already opening. A man stepped out who didn't need to raise his voice to clear a room. Ho Jang-nim didn't do carnivals, didn't do surprises, and had built his entire life around never once being caught off guard. He was about to find out his son had other plans. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to say hello and see just how far this story travels with us. Amara didn't ask him twice. She simply held out her hand, the way she would have to her own daughter, and Minjun stared at it, like nobody had offered him something without a form to sign first. When he finally took it, his grip was so light she almost missed it. The 3-legged race started with a whistle and a shove of laughing kids toward the finish line, and Minjun stumbled through the first 4 steps like a boy who had never once in his life been allowed to fall down in public. Amara laughed, loud and unbothered, and pulled him upright before he hit the grass. "You've got to trust the person next to you," she told him, tying the sash tighter at their ankles. "That's the whole trick. Stop trying to do it alone." He looked up at her like the sentence meant something bigger than the race. They came in dead last, tangled together in the grass, and he was smiling so hard his cheeks hurt in a way he didn't have a word for yet. When she spread the blanket out under the oak tree and unpacked foil-wrapped containers of jollof rice and fried plantain, Blossom dove in without ceremony, already halfway through a plantain before her mother finished setting out napkins. Minjun sat very straight, hands in his lap, waiting for permission he didn't realize he no longer needed. "Go on," Amara said gently, nudging a plate toward him. "It won't bite." He picked up the fork like it was evidence in a case and ate the first bite slowly, like he expected to be tested on it. Then something in his face cracked open. He kept eating, faster now, and by the 3rd bite his eyes were wet and he didn't seem to notice, and Amara pretended very hard not to notice either, because some things a person needed to feel without an audience. "This is really good, ma'am," he whispered, wiping his face with the back of his wrist, like it was sweat and not something else entirely. "You can call me Miss Amara," she said, "and you can have seconds." Nobody at that carnival, watching a woman feed a strange, solemn boy from her own daughter's lunch, understood yet what they were witnessing. Two black SUVs were already threading through traffic 4 blocks away, moving with the unhurried certainty of men who had never once needed to run a red light, because red lights simply learned to change for them. The SUVs rolled up to the school gates, like a door slamming shut on the whole festival. Parents scattered instinctively before their brains caught up with why. 6 men in dark suits fanned out along the fence line before the engines had even stopped, scanning rooftops, scanning faces, scanning everything except the actual danger, which was currently sitting cross-legged in the grass, holding a juice box with both hands. Hojangnim stepped out of the second vehicle already moving, jaw set, eyes doing the fast, brutal math of a man who assumed the worst as a professional habit. He had pictured this moment 100 times, in 100 nightmares. A call, a compromised perimeter, his son's name in someone else's mouth, for the wrong reasons. What he found instead was Minjun laughing at something a small girl in pigtails had said, orange juice on his upper lip, utterly unguarded in a way Hojangnim hadn't seen since before the boy could walk. He stopped 10 feet away. His men fanned out behind him, hands loose at their sides, waiting for a signal that didn't come. Amara stood up slowly, brushing grass off her skirt, unbothered by 6 armed men, staring at her like she might be carrying something more dangerous than homemade rice. "You must be his father," she said, like she was greeting a slightly late guest, instead of a man half the city crossed the street to avoid. Minjun. His voice was flat, controlled, the kind of calm that took real effort. "We're leaving." The boy's face fell instantly, the openness folding back into its familiar, careful lines. He stood, handed the juice box back to Amara, like it belonged to her and not to him, and said, so quietly only she heard it, "Thank you for borrowing you." Hojangnim's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker he didn't have a name for, and wouldn't have admitted to if he had. "Thank you," he said to Amara, 2 words, clipped and formal, the bare legal minimum of gratitude a man says when he doesn't know what he's actually grateful for. Then he turned and walked his son to the car without looking back, though Minjun did, twice, until the gate swallowed the view. The Kang compound sat behind 3 layers of wall and 1 layer of silence, so complete it had its own weather. Minjun's room overlooked a garden nobody used, manicured by staff who came and went like ghosts, tended for appearances rather than joy. That night he sat across from his father at a table built for 12 and occupied by 2, and for the first time in longer than either of them could count, he spoke without being spoken to first. "I want to go back," he said. Hojangnim looked up slowly from the report he'd been pretending to read. "Go back where?" "To Blossom's house. To Miss Amara's." The old man at the end of the table, the one who ran the household and had watched Minjun since infancy, actually set down his cup. In 8 years, the boy had asked his father for exactly nothing. Not toys, not company, not permission for anything beyond what was already scheduled for him. Requests were a kind of vulnerability, and vulnerability was a kind of exposure, and exposure was the one thing this house had been built entirely to prevent. "Absolutely not," Hojangnim said, already turning back to his papers, because the answer had come out of him on reflex before he'd thought about it at all. Minjun didn't argue. He didn't cry, didn't raise his voice, didn't do any of the things a normal 7-year-old might do to wear down a parent. He simply sat there, hands folded, eyes down, and let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of argument. It was that silence that undid his father. Hojangnim had negotiated with men who held guns to other men's heads. He had never once negotiated with his own son's quiet, because his son had never made him need to. "I'll have the house assessed," he finally said, the concession dragged out of him like a confession. "Plain clothes only. If there is so much as a hint of risk, This ends." Minjun looked up, and for one unguarded second, hope moved across his face, so plainly that his father had to look away from it. Amara's street, 3 days later, had acquired 2 new residents nobody in the neighborhood questioned. A man doing suspiciously slow landscaping work across the road, and another, parked in an unmarked sedan, pretending to read a newspaper he never turned a page of. Minjun didn't know their names, only their positions, the way he knew the layout of every room he'd ever been allowed into. He arrived at Amara's gate in a plain car, with no flags, no escort visible from the street, and felt, for the length of the walk up her driveway, almost like an ordinary boy. The smell hit him before the door even opened. Butter and something warm, something that made his stomach twist with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. Amara answered in an apron dusted white to the elbow, and behind her, a booming voice hollered something about missing pancakes, like the fate of the household depended on it. "That's my dad," Amara said, stepping aside to let him in. "Fair warning, he's a lot." Grandpa Buddy came around the corner at a speed that seemed physically impossible for a man his age, spatula raised like a weapon, silver hair wild, flour on his eyebrows for reasons nobody could later explain. "Aha! There he is, the accomplice," he bellowed, pointing the spatula at Minjun with mock fury. "3 pancakes gone missing from that plate, and don't you tell me it was the dog. We don't have a dog." Blossom came skidding into the kitchen laughing, syrup already on her chin, and grabbed Minjun's sleeve. "Run," she whispered, entirely too delighted, and then they were both sprinting through the back door into the yard, with Buddy thundering after them in his socks, hollering about justice and pancakes and the disrespect of modern children, and Minjun was laughing so hard he had to stop running just to breathe, hands on his knees, tears of something that wasn't sadness streaking down his face for the second time in a week. Down the street, the man pretending to read his newspaper watched the whole thing over the top of a business section, said something quiet into his cuff, and went back to not turning the page. Buddy caught them both eventually, scooping one under each arm like sacks of flour, and deposited them at the table with a stern look that fooled absolutely no one. "You'll both work off your crimes in dish duty," he announced, setting down a fresh stack in front of them anyway. Minjun looked at the plate, then at the old man's face, still flushed and grinning from the chase, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight since before he could remember. Ho Jiangnim came himself 4 days later, unannounced except for the fact that nothing involving him was ever truly unannounced. The landscaper across the street straightened just slightly as the car turned onto the block. A signal passed without a word being said. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, almost anything but what he found. He had run the scenarios, a rival's agent posing as a kind stranger, a setup designed to draw his son into the open, a woman paid to look this warm and this unthreatening. He had built entire contingency plans around the possibility that Amara Stephen did not exist the way she appeared to. She opened the door in jeans and a paint-stained shirt, took one look at his suit and his stone expression and the 2 men lingering by the car, and said, "You gonna stand there like you're serving a warrant, or you want coffee?" It wasn't a question so much as a correction, and it threw him enough that he actually followed her inside. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon. There was a crayon drawing taped crookedly to the fridge, a stack of mail nobody had sorted, a general clutter of a life being lived rather than managed. She poured coffee into a chipped mug without asking how he took it, and set it in front of him like the matter was decided. "Your boy," she said, leaning against the counter, arms crossed, entirely unintimidated by a man whose name made grown adults lower their voices, flinches when doors closed too fast. "He thanked me for a juice box like I'd handed him a kidney. You want to tell me what that's about, or are we going to keep pretending this is a security inspection?" Ho Jiangnim set the mug down without drinking from it. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking why a 7-year-old sits at my table, like he's waiting to be told he's not allowed to enjoy himself. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't soften either. You can run whatever kind of business you run. That's not my concern. But you're raising that boy like he's a liability instead of a child. And I've buried a husband. Mr. Kang, I know grief when I see it, wearing someone else's face. That boy isn't guarded. He's lonely. Nobody spoke to him this way. Not his lieutenants, not the men who owed him their lives, not even the last woman who'd shared his bed and his last name before she'd vanished, with secrets that had cost him more than she ever knew. He should have stood up. He should have ended the conversation, thanked her for her time, and instructed his men to quietly close the file on this entire arrangement before it became a liability of its own. Instead, he sat there, coffee cooling in front of him, and heard himself say, "He hasn't asked for anything in 4 years. Until you." Amara's expression didn't turn triumphant or soft with pity, which was somehow the thing that undid him most. She simply nodded, like he'd finally said something true, and refilled his mug without being asked. "Then maybe," she said, "it's time you figured out how to let him have it." Outside, the landscaper trimmed the same hedge for the 11th time, and down the block, in a car with an unread newspaper, a man who had once broken enemy combatants for a living watched a mafia boss sit in a stranger's kitchen and, for the first time in years, actually listen. If this story's got you hooked so far, drop a like and subscribe so you don't miss where it goes next. And tell me, where are you listening from right now? I'd love to say hello and see just how far this story has already traveled with us. The visits became a rhythm, nobody quite named out loud. Saturdays, mostly. Sometimes a stray Wednesday when Minjun's tutoring ended early and he asked, with the particular quiet insistence that had become his only form of pleading, if they could go see Blossom instead of straight home. Ho Jiangnim stopped pretending these were security assessments somewhere around the 4th visit. He simply came. He stood at the edge of Amara's yard one afternoon holding a mug he hadn't touched, watching his son shriek and scramble across the grass, soaked to the skin, firing a neon water gun at Buddy with the kind of reckless joy that had no file, no precedent, nothing in 8 years of careful reports to compare it to. Buddy ambushed the boy from behind a hedge, drenching him fully, and Minjun's laugh cracked out of him so loud and so unguarded that a bird startled out of the tree above them. "He's never laughed like that," Ho Jiangnim said, mostly to himself. Amara, beside him with her own mug, didn't look at him when she answered. Kids aren't supposed to save their laughing for special occasions. That's supposed to be the default setting. He watched his son get ambushed again, watched him retaliate with the specific fury of the betrayed, watched Buddy fall dramatically into the grass, clutching his chest like he'd been mortally wounded, and felt his own mouth do something it hadn't done in 10 years without him deciding to let it. Amara caught it out of the corner of her eye and said nothing, but something in her shoulders eased, like she'd been waiting to see if it was possible at all. "You should be careful," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Being kind to a man like me isn't without cost." "I didn't ask what it costs," she said. I asked what you needed. Those aren't the same question." She sipped her coffee. "You keep waiting for me to be scared of you. I've buried a husband who died doing something honest, and it still didn't save him from the world. I'm not scared of what you are. I'm just watching what you do." He didn't have an answer for that, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, not having an answer didn't feel like a weakness. Daesung had been waiting a long time for his chairman to become predictable, and predictability, when it finally arrived, tasted like opportunity. He'd noticed the change months back. The calendar gaps that used to be reserved for territory disputes now blocked off under a vague label that fooled nobody who'd worked for the organization more than a year. He'd noticed the driver's logs, the same neighborhood, the same modest house, entered and cross-referenced with a patience that had nothing to do with loyalty. Daesung had spent 15 years underneath a man he respected and resented in roughly equal measure, watching him build an empire on discipline and distance, and now watching all of it soften at the edges over a woman and a child who had no place in the ledger. He gathered 3 men he trusted with money, and 2 he trusted with silence, and laid a map on the table that traced every one of Hojangnim's Saturday routes to a single house on a quiet street. "He's building a weakness," Daesung told them, tapping the address. "We're going to use it." The plan was simple, in the way effective plans usually were. Wait for the chairman's absence. A scheduled meeting, 3 districts away, unmovable, verified in advance, and take the house before he could return. Not to harm the boy. Not yet. Daesung wasn't interested in martyring a child he might still need alive as leverage. He wanted the woman, the grandfather, and enough chaos to force Hojangnim into a choice that would fracture him publicly, permanently, in front of the men whose loyalty was currently up for negotiation. "He built an empire on never being caught soft," Daesung said, folding the map. "Let's show everyone exactly how soft he's gotten." Saturday came bright and ordinary, the kind of afternoon that gave no warning at all. Minjun and Blossom were building a blanket fort in the yard, under Buddy's supervisory commentary. "Reinforce the west wall, soldier. That pillow's structurally unsound." When the first black van rolled slowly to the end of the street and idled a beat too long, Buddy noticed before anyone else did, because noticing things a beat before anyone else was the entire architecture of who he'd once been. He didn't shout. He set down his coffee, said, "Kids, inside, now, it's a game," in a tone cheerful enough not to frighten them, and firm enough that they obeyed instantly, and quietly threw the deadbolt behind them. "Amara," his voice had changed entirely, flat and fast. "Get the children upstairs, into the closet, with the reinforced door, the one I told you never to ask about. Now." She didn't ask questions either, not with 2 children's hands gripped in hers, hustling them up the stairs, while her father moved through the house with a speed and precision that had nothing to do with pancakes. The men came over the back fence 12 minutes later, 4 of them, moving with professional quiet through a yard that Buddy had, over the years of paranoid habit nobody ever questioned, rigged with more surprises than his family knew existed. A tripwire near the shed dropped a stack of paint cans directly into the path of the first man through. A garden hose, coiled with deliberate carelessness, tangled the second at the ankles hard enough to put him on the ground. Buddy met the third with a cast-iron skillet, swung with the unshowy efficiency of a man who had done far worse to far more dangerous people, dropping him where he stood. The fourth got a shot off before Buddy closed the gap, a wild round that punched into the porch railing, and upstairs, Amara pressed both children against her, one hand over Blossom's mouth, the other locked around Minjun's shoulders, feeling him shake without making a sound, the boy who had spent his whole life being trained for exactly this, and hating that the training was, in this one terrible moment, useful. Ho Jangnim's phone buzzed mid-meeting with a single word from Buddy's number, a code the 2 men had quietly agreed on without either of them acknowledging why they'd needed it. He was in the car before the second ring, and the men behind him understood from his face alone that the meeting was over and something else had just begun. He arrived 11 minutes later with 3 vehicles and men who moved like the fence wasn't there. Daesung was in the side yard, gun trained toward the house, shouting something about files and terms, and a conversation Ho Jangnim no longer had any interest in having through an intermediary. "You've made a mistake," Ho Jangnim said, stepping into the open, unarmed, hands visible, because the only thing that mattered now was ending this before it reached the closet upstairs. "The mistake was yours, Daesong said, gun steady. 15 years, I watched you build something untouchable, and you handed it a soft spot the size of a house. You're right that it's a weakness, Ho Jiangnim said quietly. You're wrong about what kind. He moved before Daesong's finger finished tightening, closing the distance with the brutal economy of a man who had learned violence before he'd learned much else, driving the gun arm wide as the shot went into the fence, instead of anything that mattered. What followed was short and ugly and entirely without ceremony, years of restrained fury behind every strike, until Daesong was on the ground, disarmed, and Ho Jiangnim's men had the rest secured before the echo of the last gunshot had finished dying against the houses. He found them in the closet, exactly where Buddy had said, Amara wrapped around both children like a wall built out of nothing but will. Minjun looked up, saw his father's face through the crack of the door, and came apart entirely, not with fear this time, but with the specific collapse of a child who has just understood, all at once, that he is safe, and had not known, until that second, how heavy the alternative had been. He didn't run to a bodyguard. He ran past every armed man in that hallway and threw himself against Amara instead, sobbing into her shoulder, the word he'd never once used for anyone, and she held him like she'd been waiting years for someone to let her. Ho Jiangnim watched his son call another woman that word and felt something in his chest break open instead of closing, the way he'd expected it to. The syndicate did not survive Daesong's coup, though not in the way Daesong had intended. Within a month, Ho Jiangnim had quietly handed federal investigators a decade of ledgers, routes, and names, enough to dismantle the entire structure, legally, permanently, in a way that violence never could have. He kept nothing for himself, but the freedom that came after, and he found, once the last file had left his hands, that he did not miss the weight of it at all. The garden behind Amara's house had never looked better than it did that afternoon. The fence repaired, the roses Buddy had planted in some grand act of denial finally blooming, despite everything. Buddy pressed a scrapbook into Minjun's hands, thick with photographs. Pancake disasters, water gun ambushes, a crooked crayon drawing preserved under plastic, and said gruffly, "Every family needs proof it happened. Wasn't going to let you forget a single pancake we fought over." Minjun held the book like it was something sacred, which, to him, it was. Ho Jiangnim found Amara by the tree, where a three-legged race had started all of it, and for once in his life, said what he meant, without calculating the cost first. "I believe," he said, "I've spent all this time borrowing you. I'd like to stop." She raised an eyebrow, arms crossed, entirely unhurried, the same way she'd been unhurried the first day he'd shown up in a suit, expecting an enemy, and found a kitchen instead. "And what exactly are you asking for instead, Mr. Kang?" "Keep us," he said simply. "Both of us, permanently." "No borrowing." Blossom shrieked something delighted from across the yard, and Minjun laughed at whatever it was. And Amara looked at the boy who had once asked a stranger a question at a school festival that had changed the shape of 4 lives, and reached for Ho Jiangnim's hand, like the answer had never really been in question. That's this story, start to finish. If you rode this whole journey with me, hit like and subscribe for the next one. And before you go, tell me where you're listening from. I want to see just how far this story really traveled, and I'd love the chance to say hello to every single one of you.